He said it like a man reading a fence post. Not a wife, a cook, that was a year ago. Now the rain was coming down so hard it sounded like the sky had finally decided to pay something back. And he was standing on a porch he'd built plank by plank with his own 2 hands. Looking at her like the answer to a question he hadn't asked yet. My name's Naomi Prescott, and this happened outside a town most maps don't bother naming anymore. In the high, dry country, where the grass turns the color of old rope by August, and a woman's whole future can hinge on whether a train is 2 hours late. I was 26 that spring. I'd never been west of Ohio in my life. I want to tell you how I ended up on a porch in a rainstorm. Waiting to hear the rest of a sentence a man had already started once before and gotten wrong. It started on a platform in a town called Copper Bend, in the Territory on the 9th of March. The westbound was running 2 hours behind, and the wind coming down off the ridge had that particular grit to it that gets into your teeth and your collar, and the corners of your eyes no matter how you turn your face. I'd been standing there since noon with one trunk, a carpet bag, and a letter in my coat pocket that no longer matched the man who was supposed to be waiting for me. The letter had promised a husband. A house, a name to answer to that wasn't the one I'd worn my whole life like a coat that never quite fit. What I got, once the station master finally took pity on me and started asking around, was the news that the man in question had married a widow from the next county over 3 weeks prior, and hadn't found it worth his time to send word that I shouldn't bother coming. I didn't cry on that platform. I want you to understand that because people noticed it. Copper Bend had maybe 400 souls in it, and the window of the general store served as the only newspaper anybody needed. A woman standing alone with her trunk for the better part of an afternoon was a headline whether she wanted to be one or not. By the time the sun dropped behind the ridge and the platform emptied of everyone who had honest business there, I was still standing with my chin level and my hands folded over the strap of my bag, staring at a horizon that owed me exactly nothing. That's when the wagon came down Main Street, 3 children in the back of it, arguing over a slingshot loud enough to be heard over the wind, and it stopped in front of me without my asking it to. The man driving didn't climb down right away. He sat there with the reins loose in his hands, looking at me the way you'd look at a fence post to see if it needed straightening, not pity. Just an assessment. You cook, he said, not a question, not really, though it took me a second to understand it was the only one being offered. I can, I told him. Pays small, room's small too. 3 kids and none of them easy, he paused. Heard about your situation. I'm sorry for your trouble as well, I said, because word travels fast in a town that size. And I'd already caught the shape of a story that wasn't mine to ask about yet. A wife who wasn't in that wagon and should have been. He didn't answer that. He just set the brake and climbed down to load my trunk, and that was the whole of it. No promise, no courtship. Nothing that would have made much of a tale if anyone had been foolish enough to write it down at the time. The trunk was heavier than it looked, and he didn't say anything about that either. He set it in the wagon bed between a coil of rope and a feed sack. And the 3 children stopped arguing just long enough to look at me the way children look at weather, trying to guess if it's going to be the kind that ruins the picnic. The littlest one, a girl of maybe 6 with a gap where her front tooth should have been, was holding the slingshot now. She didn't offer it to her brothers. She held it against her chest like it might be taken from her too, and she stared. That's Junie, the man said, not looking back. Boys are Amos and Eli. Nobody said hello. I didn't expect them to. The road out of Copper Bend ran west and then curved north, past the last fence line anybody in town would have claimed, into country that opened up flat and pale under a sky gone the color of an old nickel. I watched it pass without asking questions, and he didn't offer answers to questions I hadn't asked. Somewhere past the 2nd mile, the boys picked their argument back up in lower voices, like they'd remembered there was a stranger in the wagon and it called for some manners. House is small, he said eventually, eyes on the road the whole time. Barn's bigger than it looks. There's a room off the kitchen, used to be for storage. It's yours if you want it. I'll want it. Stove needs a knock on the left side before it'll draw right. Nobody's fixed it. I'll learn it. He nodded once, like that had settled something between us, and didn't speak again until the house came into view, low, gray, timbered. a porch sagging on one end like a shoulder that had been carrying too much for too long. A dog rose up from the shade underneath it and didn't bark, just watched, the same way the children had. I climbed down before he could come around to help me, and I stood a moment looking at the place the way I'd looked at that horizon back on the platform. Assessing, not hoping. Hope, I'd learned that afternoon, was a thing you could spend down to nothing if you weren't careful with it. Supper's whatever's in the pantry, he said. Wasn't much of a system before. There'll be one now. That was the first thing I said that made him look at me a beat longer than the words called for. Not long, just a beat. Now, before I take you inside that kitchen, I want you to sit with something. A stranger's promise, given on a train platform 2 states away, had already broken clean in half by the time I stepped off that train. And the thing that replaced it wasn't a promise at all. It was a job. I didn't know yet that a job could turn into something with roots, the kind you can't dig up without tearing half the yard along with it. That part of the story is still a few seasons off. Stay with me. The kitchen smelled of cold ash and something gone slightly sour in a bowl left too long on the table. Junie trailed me through the doorway, still gripping that slingshot, watching my hands the whole time as I started, without anybody telling me to, opening cupboards and taking stock. Flour. Half a sack of beans, a tin of coffee, salt gone hard in its dish from disuse. You'll want that fire lit if you mean to cook tonight, the man said from the doorway, hat still on his head. I mean to, he left me to it. I heard the wagon creak as he unloaded my trunk onto the porch, heard him say something low to the boys about the horses. Heard the screen door bang twice more before it settled into whatever rhythm it was going to keep for the rest of that year. I knelt at the stove and found the spot he'd mentioned on the left side and gave it one hard knock. The way a woman knocks on a thing she intends to make her own, not a thing she's only borrowing. The stove caught on the second match. Eli, the middle boy, I'd learned, the quiet one, brought in 2 split logs without being asked, arms straining under the weight, watching me the whole time to see if I'd noticed the effort. I did. I didn't say anything about it, only moved the logs where I wanted them, and something in his shoulders came loose. Junie stayed in the doorway. She still hadn't put that slingshot down. You hungry? I asked her. She didn't answer. She just looked at my hands instead, the way they moved over the flour sack, testing its weight, finding it lighter than a house with 3 children in it had any right to have. By the time the man came back in, stamping dust off his boots at the threshold, there was a smell in that kitchen that hadn't been there in some time. Beans soaking, coffee starting, a heel of bread going into a pan with the last of the lard to see if it would still fry up right. He stood in the doorway a moment longer than the errand called for. Boys'll eat anything, he said. Junie's particular. I'll manage. He nodded the way a man nods when he's decided against saying anything more, and went back out to the porch, where my trunk sat catching the last orange light of the day. I heard him bring it in himself a few minutes later, just inside the door, without being asked, and without a word about doing it. Supper was beans and fried bread and coffee strong enough to hold an argument with. The boys ate like the meal might be taken from them if they slowed down. Junie picked at hers then, watching no one, thinking herself unwatched, ate more than she meant for anyone to notice. The man ate at the head of the table, saying little, and when he was done, he pushed his chair back and looked around the room like he was seeing it fresh. Fire going, lamp lit. The girl's slingshot finally laid down on the bench beside her plate instead of clutched to her chest. There's a room off the back, he said. Was my sister's before she married and moved on. It'll do, I agreed. He looked at me again, that same beat too long, then stood and told the boys it was time to see to the horses before full dark. The screen door banged twice on the way out, same as before, same as it would for the rest of that year. I sat a moment at the table with Junie, the fire ticking behind us in the stove, and I didn't reach for the child's plate until she pushed it toward me herself. Outside, the sky had gone the color of a bruise starting to heal, and the dust the wagon had crossed that afternoon settled slow over the yard. Over the trunk now standing empty in a dead woman's old room. Over the whole quiet shape of a house that, before that day, had kept no particular order at all. That room off the back held the smell of cedar and something older underneath it, some scent of a life that had already left it once and hadn't been replaced. I set my bag on the narrow bed and didn't unpack it that first night. I lay there listening to the house settle, to a boy coughing somewhere down the hall, to the wind working at a shutter whose name I hadn't learned yet. By the second morning, I'd already learned 3 things about that house. The stove drew badly unless you gave the flue a full turn past where it seemed to want to stop. The well bucket had a crack in it that made it sing on the way up. And Junie woke before anyone else, sitting at her window in the gray light with her knees pulled to her chest, watching the yard like she expected something to arrive in it that never quite did. I didn't ask her what she was watching for. I set a cup of water beside her instead and went to start the stove. The man, Caleb, I'd learned his name was, though it took me the better part of a week to hear anyone use it, came in from the barn smelling of hay and cold iron, and ate what I put in front of him without comment. I came to understand by the second week that this silence was the shape his approval took. When the biscuits came out right, he ate 2 extra. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. Eli, the middle boy, tested me the way boys test anything new to a house. A toad left in the flour bin, a length of rope strung ankle-high across the kitchen doorway. I stepped over the rope without looking down and didn't say a word, and by the second attempt he'd lost interest. The way a dog loses interest in a fence that won't rattle no matter how hard you lean on it. The days took a shape after that, fire before light, bread by mid-morning. Mending in the hour before supper, my fingers finding Caleb's shirts gone thin at the elbows, Junie's hem let down twice already by some other hand, and needing letting down again. I found a cedar-lined basket in the sister's old room, empty, and started keeping my needles in it without asking whose it had been. Nobody told me to stop. 3 weeks in, I noticed the third step up to the porch had a give to it, a soft complaint under the boot that Caleb stepped over automatically. The way a man steps over a threshold he's crossed 10,000 times without thinking about it once. I didn't mention it either. I just started stepping over it too, without meaning to, the way you learn a house by everything it doesn't bother telling you outright. The drought hadn't started yet. That first autumn still gave us rain enough. The grass held its color a while longer, and the well didn't sing on empty rope yet. I didn't know it then, setting the table those first weeks. Counting plates that had gone from 4 to 5 without anybody commenting on it. I didn't know I was learning the shape of a year that hadn't happened yet. All I knew was that Junie had started leaving her boots by the door instead of the middle of the floor, and that in a house like that one, this was about as close to a welcome as anybody was ever going to say out loud. If you've stuck with me this far, you already know this isn't a story about weather. It's a story about how slowly a stranger can turn into somebody's whole reason for getting up in the morning, and how long it can take a stubborn man to admit that out loud. We've got a fever, a drought, and a well that goes bone dry ahead of us yet, so stay close. The first frost came early that year, a Tuesday, the ground gone hard and white by the time the rooster called. I was up before it, same as always, and found Eli at the table already, sleeves too long for his arms, hands wrapped around a cup he'd poured for himself. He didn't usually rise before me. He didn't usually pour anything himself either. I set the coffee pot down without asking why. He drank what he'd poured. He didn't look at me, but he didn't look away, which in that house was its own kind of answer. Caleb came in from the barn with Frost still clinging to his collar, and said the well rope had frozen solid at the crank. He said it flat, the way he said most things, no complaint in it, just a fact laid down like a board across a gap. I handed him a towel for his hands before he had to ask for one. That became the shape of that winter. Small facts laid down met before the asking had to happen at all. Junie took a fever in December that put her flat on her back for 4 days, and I sat up 2 of those nights with a cloth and a bowl of water gone lukewarm long before dawn. Caleb stood in the doorway some hour past midnight, not saying anything, just standing there the way a man stands guard over something he can't fix with his hands, no matter how good those hands are with everything else. On the 3rd night, he brought me a blanket without being asked and set it over my shoulders from behind, quick, like a man setting down something too hot to hold. I didn't turn around. I said thank you to the wall in front of me. He said nothing back and left, and the space where he'd been standing held warm a while longer than it had any right to. The fever broke on the 4th morning. Junie asked for me by name, except it wasn't quite my name. It was something smaller and more particular, a word that made Caleb pause in the doorway with an armful of firewood and say nothing at all. He just stood there a beat too long before he went on to the stove. I didn't correct the child. I didn't repeat the word back either. I only tucked the blanket in tighter and let it sit in that room like a coal that hadn't decided yet whether it meant to catch. By January, the well rope had been oiled twice against the freeze. The third step still gave its same soft complaint. And 5 plates went on that table every night without anybody bothering to count them anymore. I'd stopped thinking in weeks by then. I'd started thinking in what needed mending before the thaw: a torn cuff, a stubborn hinge, a coat let out at the shoulders for a boy going through a growth spurt his own bones seemed startled by. None of us spoke yet of the year turning. There was no reason to. The drought hadn't announced itself. It would come the way most things in that house came. Quiet, without ceremony, already halfway arrived before anybody thought to put a name to it. The first sign was the color of the grass along the fence line, gone from green to the pale yellow of old paper by the middle of March, weeks before it had any business doing that. Caleb noticed it the way he noticed most things, without comment, standing at the rail with his hat pushed back, looking at the ground like it had said something to him he needed a moment to answer. I noticed him noticing. That's how I came to learn what a drought sounds like before anybody in that house used the word out loud. It sounds like a man standing at a window a beat too long. Like a man counting cattle under his breath, as though the number might change if he said it slower. By April, the creek had narrowed down to a rope of brown water threading through cracked mud, and the well took longer every single morning to fill a bucket. I started rationing without anybody telling me to. Less water for the washing, more saved back for the stock. The children bathed together to save what could be saved. Caleb watched me do this and said only, "Good thinking," and went back out to check the fence line. The fence didn't need checking. I understood that even then. The garden I'd put in that first spring, tomatoes and beans in careful rows behind the house, began to wilt despite the water I carried to it in the cool of morning. Before the sun could take it back from me twice over. I stood over the drooping rows one evening with the bucket still in my hand, and didn't move for a while. Caleb came up beside me, looked at the same wilting vines, and said nothing about the garden at all. "Step's still loose," he said instead. It wasn't loose. He'd fixed it twice already that spring. I understood, standing there in the failing light, that this was the shape his worry took, sideways, aimed at wood instead of weather, because weather couldn't be mended and a step could. I didn't point that out to him. I just went back to the well and filled the bucket again. The children felt it too, the way children always feel a house holding its breath. Amos, the older boy, the one who spoke least, asked me one night at supper, plate barely touched, whether the cows would be all right. I told him yes before I had any right to know that for certain, and he ate the rest of his supper like the answer had settled something in his stomach right alongside the food. We were 41 days out from any real rain by the time I started marking a calendar I'd nailed inside the pantry door. A habit I never explained, and Caleb never asked about. Though I caught him looking at it once, hat still on, reading the tally the way a man reads a debt he fully intends to pay down. I rationed the wash water without being told to, whites first, then the darker things, then the floor in that order so nothing got wasted twice over. Caleb watched me do this from the barn doorway one morning, the basin balanced against my hip, gray water sloshing at the rim, and he said nothing. That evening, though, he brought me a second basin from the barn, wider, shallower, better suited to carrying, and set it on the porch rail without a word. I used it the next morning like it had always been there. Junie turned 6 that August with no cake, because there was no butter to spare, and nobody had thought to mention it was her birthday until she said so herself, quietly, buttoning her boots by the door. I went still a moment, then took the last of the sugar and made a flat spiced cake in the skillet, thin as a dinner plate, and she ate 2 pieces without anybody asking if she wanted more. And she didn't cry, though her chin trembled once before she got it back under control, in a way that reminded me, for reasons I couldn't have explained to you then, of myself on that platform a year before. Caleb noticed the cake. He noticed the sugar tin sitting empty on the shelf after. He said nothing about either one. But the following week, he rode the 11 miles into Copper Bend and back in one day, through heat that made the road shimmer like water that wasn't there, and came home with a fresh sack of sugar he set on the table without a word, the way he set down anything he didn't want thanked for out loud. Eli, who spoke less than either of his siblings, started leaving things for me. A smooth stone, a blue jay feather, a knot of driftwood shaped if you tilted your head right like a running horse. He left them on the windowsill above the wash basin and never once said they were meant for me, and I never asked. But that windowsill filled up through August the way a ledger fills, one entry after another, small and unremarked, adding up to something neither of us had a name for yet. The drought held on. The creek thinned to a brown ribbon you could step across without wetting your boot. At night I'd stand on the porch with that second basin empty in my hands, looking west toward the range where the grass had gone the color of old rope, and I wouldn't go back inside for a long while, though there was nothing out there to see. I think, if I'm honest with you, I was looking for the same thing Junie used to look for at her window, something that might arrive, even if I couldn't have told you what. Here's where it got hard. If you've ever watched somebody you'd come to care for start doing arithmetic they don't want anyone else to see, you already know what came next for us. Stay with me because this part changed everything. The well went dry on a Tuesday. Caleb came up from the pump house with his hat in his hand, not on his head, and that told me everything before he said a single word. I was at the basin, elbows deep in wash water, and I straightened up and wiped my hands on my apron and waited for it. Dry, he said, not low. Dry, the children were at the table with their lessons. Junie looked up. The older two didn't, which meant they already understood enough not to. He didn't sit down. He stood in the doorway with the sky behind him doing nothing at all. No clouds, no wind, the kind of flat blue that had stopped meaning anything good weeks before. I'd seen him worried before that day. I hadn't seen him stand quite that still. There's the creek, I said, far as it is. Far as it is, he agreed and went back out. I watched him from the window walk the fence line toward the west range slower than his usual pace, and I understood he wasn't checking the fence at all. He was giving himself a reason to walk somewhere without anybody watching his face do whatever it was about to do. That night, after the children were asleep, he sat on the porch in the chair that had become his without either of us ever naming it his. I brought him coffee he hadn't asked for and set it on the rail and didn't stay to watch him drink it. But I didn't go far either. I sat on the step below him, the one he'd fixed, the one that no longer complained under a boot, and looked out at the dark shapes of the barn and the paddock fence. We'll haul water if it comes to that, he said, more to the dark than to me. I know. Might come to selling off some of the herd, can't feed what we can't water. I didn't answer that. There was nothing to say to a man doing arithmetic that had no comfortable answer sitting inside it anywhere. I'd learned that much over the year, when to offer something, and when to just be a shape near him in the dark so the arithmetic didn't have to get done entirely alone. He turned the cup once on the rail, not drinking from it, just turning it in his hand. You've been counting something, he said. I've seen you doing it. Marking days somewhere. I didn't look at him. Everybody's counting something this summer. He let that sit a while. Somewhere out past the barn, a bird I didn't know the name of called once and then stopped. The sky held its dry, dark blue and gave nothing away, same as it had given nothing away for weeks by then. The bank sent a man out the second week of that dry spell, young, polite, sweating clean through his collar, in a suit built for a cooler season than the one he'd chosen to wear it in. He stood in the yard and talked about extensions and terms in a voice reaching for gentleness and mostly landing on a kind of careful distance. The distance of a man delivering news he didn't make, but wasn't about to undo either. I was hanging wash on the line within earshot of the whole conversation and didn't pretend otherwise. Afterward, Caleb stood by the fence a long while, not doing anything at all, which for a man like him was its own confession. I brought him coffee he hadn't asked for and set it on the rail beside his hand and went back to the wash without a word. He drank it standing there, looking at nothing in particular. When he came in for supper that night, he ate everything on his plate, which I took to mean something, though I couldn't have told you exactly what. Eli started sleeping badly after that. He'd come to the kitchen in the small hours in his night shirt, feet bare on the cold floor, and find me already awake. I was always already awake by then, banking the stove or straining milk by lamplight, and he'd sit at the table without a word until I poured him a half cup of milk warmed with a little sugar. And he'd drink it and go back to bed without either of us remarking on the arrangement, like it had always existed. Like it hadn't started 3 weeks earlier with a frightened boy, standing in a doorway and a woman who'd simply pulled a chair out for him. 41 days since rain turned into more than 60, I kept marking the calendar inside the pantry door. Caleb rode the 11 miles into town and came back with news of 2 other outfits already selling off stock at a loss, just to keep the rest of the herd fed through what was left of the season. He didn't say much else about the trip. He didn't have to. Then, on a Wednesday close to what should have been the middle of summer's worst stretch, Junie wouldn't eat her breakfast. I knelt by her chair, felt her forehead, and found it hot as a stove lid left too long over the fire. "Fever," I said. "Since when?" Caleb was already up. "Since last night." I thought it would pass. He was already reaching for his hat. "I'll go for the doctor." "You'll go for willow bark first." "It's faster, and it's in the pantry." I was already moving toward the stove, already had water heating before he'd finished lacing his boots. And he stood a moment in the doorway, watching my hands work with a certainty that made him feel, not for the first time that year, like the house ran on a competence he'd never actually hired for. He rode for the doctor anyway. I didn't ask him not to. The fever broke by evening, the way fevers do more often than they don't, and the doctor said as much when he finally arrived 4 hours later, dust-covered and unnecessary, and charged for the visit regardless. Caleb paid it without complaint. I noticed that too, that he paid for things he didn't strictly need, when the not needing had come from something I'd already done, like care given deserved to be matched by care spent. Dollar for dollar, whether or not the doctor had done a thing. That night Junie slept finally, hair damp against her pillow, and Eli, the boy who left things on the windowsill, stood in the doorway a long time, watching her breathe before he went off to his own bed without being told to. Caleb found me on the porch afterward, that second basin in my hands again, though there was no water in it and no reason to be holding it at all except that my hands needed something to do. "She's all right," he said. "I know." He stood beside me, not close enough. The West Range lay flat and pale under a moon thin as a paring knife, and neither of us spoke of the grass, or the well, or the weeks since the last real rain. Though it sat between us the way weather always did in that house by then, unspoken, and understood anyway. The drought didn't break that week or the next. By the time the well had been dry 3 full weeks, Caleb was rationing water for the stock ahead of the house. And I understood without being told to fill pots in the morning, while there was still pressure to be had. I boiled less, I hung wash less often, saving what I could. The children didn't complain, though Eli went quieter in the heat, and Junie took to reading on the porch in the hour before supper, close enough to hear if anybody called for her. Caleb worked the West Range from before light until the sun made the work foolish, then came back gray with dust, and I had water waiting and a plate, and nothing said about either one. One evening he stood a long while at the pump before coming in, working the handle though nothing came, watching the dry spout the way a man watches something he's already lost and knows it. I brought him a cup from the kitchen's reserve without asking. He looked at it, then at me, and didn't thank me in words. He drank it standing there, and when he handed the cup back, our fingers touched at the rim, brief, unremarked, the kind of contact that in another house, another year, might have meant nothing at all. That night I lay awake listening to the house tick as it cooled, Junie's breathing steady down the hall, Eli's occasional turning, Caleb's step once, twice, across the floor above me, pacing. I thought, though I didn't know for what. In the morning, his eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with sun. We're close now to the end of this. If you've ever waited a whole year for one sentence to get said right, you know exactly what was writing on that porch by the time the sky finally changed its mind. The rain came the way debts come due, all at once after weeks of nothing. Right around the anniversary of the day, the westbound had left me standing on that platform in Copper Bend, with a trunk and a letter that didn't mean anything anymore. The clouds came up gray over the western ridge in the late afternoon, thick and moving with real intent this time. The children saw it first. Eli ran the fence line, shouting it to nobody in particular. Junie and Amos stood in the yard with their faces turned up like something might be poured directly into their open mouths if they waited long enough. It came at dusk. Slow at first, fat drops striking dust that hadn't held water in 10 weeks, throwing up small dark craters across the yard. Then it came harder, and the smell of it filled the whole porch, wet dust and old wood and something green underneath that hadn't been there in months. I came out with the basin, meaning to catch what ran off the eave for wash water, the way I'd done 100 small practical things that whole year without ever asking whether they mattered. Caleb was already on the porch, the one he'd rebuilt for me back in the second month, plank by plank, without ever saying why the old one hadn't been good enough. He didn't step aside to let me pass to the rail. He stood exactly where he was, watching the rain come down past the roof's edge in a bright seam of falling water lit gold by what was left of the day. "I said a year ago I needed a cook," he said. Not loud, just enough to carry the short distance between us. I didn't move. That was true enough at the time. He turned the cup he still wasn't drinking from and set it down at last on the rail, empty. It isn't the whole of it anymore. The rain kept on filling the silence the way it was filling the yard, the troughs, the cracked earth all around that house. "I don't need a cook," he said. "I need you." I set the basin down on the boards. It rocked once, water trembling inside it, and then went still. I didn't go back for it. I crossed that porch the same way I'd crossed the platform in Copper Bend a year before, chin level. No hurry in it. Like a woman who'd learned the hard way not to spend hope before she was sure it would be met. And I stood close enough that the rain off the eave came down between us, and then it didn't matter anymore, because he'd already closed the last of that distance himself. We didn't say much else that night. There wasn't much left that needed saying. The well filled back up over the next 2 weeks, slow at first and then steady, and the creek widened out of its rope of brown water into something that actually deserved to be called a creek again. The herd that survived the worst of it came through thinner but alive, and the garden came back stubborn the way gardens do when you fought for every drop that ever went into them. Junie still keeps a slingshot she's never once fired at anything. Eli still leaves things on that windowsill, though these days I think he does it on purpose. And every March, right around the anniversary of a train that left without me on it, Caleb finds some reason to fix a step on that porch that was never actually broken in the first place. I think about that platform sometimes. How certain I was, standing there with my trunk and my ruined letter, that the worst thing that could happen to a person was being left behind by somebody who'd made a promise and didn't keep it. I didn't know yet that sometimes the better story is the one where nobody promises you anything at all, and you build the whole thing yourself, one plank, one basin, one quiet Tuesday at a time, until it's sturdier than any promise could have made it. So I'll leave you with this one. If you'd been standing on that platform in my boots, the letter gone wrong, the wind pulling grit into your collar, and a stranger's wagon pulling up without being asked to, would you have climbed in? Would you have stayed quiet through that first cold winter, or would you have needed him to say it sooner than he did? Let me know where you're watching this from tonight, and what you'd have done in my place. And if this one found its way into you the way it found its way into me writing it down, give it a like, stick around, and tell somebody else who needs a story like this one. I'll see you in the next one.